Good morning. I'm Jessie Poon, Professor of Geography at the University of Buffalo in New York. I'm pleased to welcome you to Regional Studies Association's first global webinar series. Before I speak about the series, let me first introduce the Regional Studies Association, or RSA, to those of you who may be joining us for the first time. RSA is a global and interdisciplinary network for regional research and policy. It supports members who are engaged in the latest research on regional development and problems. It provides funding schemes, networking, and publishing opportunities to grow research and careers. Our organization is global with members in 80 countries. The first law of geography states that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. In 2020, we find ourselves having to relate distantly than proximately and developing ways of relating in that distance. The new space of distant relating, primarily in digital space, means that the RSA decided to transform its events program to online delivery. We introduced a number of webinar series, provided platforms for knowledge exchange and professional training. These include the Professional Development Webinar Series and the Regions, Cities, and Industry Webinar Series. RSA is a friendly, supportive community, and what better evidence do we have for this than the people who have helped to make today's webinar possible. To Professor Wai-chung Liu at the Chinese Academy of Science in Beijing, thank you very much. The idea for a globe-trotting online event series emerged from the need to recognize that ideas continue to buzz across our global community despite the pandemic. RSA Global is organized by and for the RSA community. It began in Australasia yesterday, and the second stop is here today in China. We hope that RSA Global will offer the opportunity to showcase research and engage with researchers across the globe. The events are funded by the RSA and is free and open to all. For those who will be missing the series, recordings of the webinars will be made available on the Members Lounge. We hope you will join us in other RSA Global sessions because the series will run right through the 16th of November, with a final stop here in North America. Thank you for being here, and I wish you all an enjoyable day.
Hello, and welcome to the plenary session for RSA Global China 2020. My name is Tom Kemeny. I am an associate professor in the School of Business and Management at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm going to be acting as the chair for this plenary session. The title of the talk to be given today is Interconnected Worlds of Electronics, Global Production Networks, and East Asia. And our primary speaker today is Professor Henry Wai-chung, Yeung from the National University of Singapore, in Singapore, of course. Henry probably needs little introduction to many of you, but Henry is the distinguished professor at the Department of Geography in the National University of Singapore. He is co-director of the Global Productions Network Center and director of the J.Y. Pillay Comparative Asia Research Center in the NUS Global Asia Institute. He is a leading social scientist specializing in theories and the geography of transnational corporations, global production networks, and global value chains, East Asian firms, and developmental states in the global economy. And so we will have Henry giving us a half-an-hour talk to be followed by some commentary by our discussant, Dr. Karen Lai from Durham University in the UK. Karen is associate professor at the Department of Geography at Durham University. Her recent projects examine everyday financialization through the global networks of financial advisors and consumers, and the global financial networks of investment banks and law firms in Asia. She serves on the executive committees of the Global Network on Financial Geography and the Economic Geography Research Group of the Royal Geographical Society with Institute of British Geographers. And so I don't want to have too much commentary because I think we're in for a treat with Henry and Karen. And so Henry has half an hour to talk. and then followed by about 7 or 8 minutes of discussion from Karen, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. For those of you in the audience, when you have questions, the easiest thing to do will be to push the button that says Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then type those questions into that box. And then when it comes to the question and answer time, please, what I will do is I will try and collate those questions and read them to Henry and Karen, and so they will be able to respond to them. So the best place when you've got questions is in that Q&A box. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Henry to get us started. So please take it away, Henry.
First of all, thank you all for joining this webinar organized by the Regional Studies Association. It's my great pleasure to be coming back to the RSA to offer this presentation today. Of course, it's an auspicious moment to speak in Singapore here, and of course in Asia, given it's US election day right now. So I'm glad that you have stayed with us, whether this is a distraction or otherwise. Anyway, I'm going to talk about interconnected world of electronics. I see the list of participants. There are many friends there. Some of you might have heard this before, so pardon me, please. I shall be brief and try to complete this presentation within 30 minutes so that we have a bit of time for discussion. All right. Okay, so let me go straight into the introduction. I think given what's happening in the current year, many of us have a great sense of how important it is to understand the global economy, the interconnections across the world that create all kinds of opportunities and disruptions in the current COVID-19 pandemic, as well as what's going to come in the this particular decade of the 2020s. Whatever happens, it's fair to say we have a good sense that global production networks or global value chains are the underlying platforms, if you like, the platforms on which the world is built, so to speak. And of course, when that platform is undergoing some disruptions during the past many months, all of us feel it immediately. On the other hand, I think in the academic research, whether in economic geography and regional studies broadly conceived, as well as the broader social sciences, we have a good sense of this line of research by now. It's about 2 decades. So today I will also sort of make a few connections across GPN and GVC for global value chain research. By and large, I think this big body of work has given us a good sense of the complex connections, interdependencies in the global economy. Those of us who are looking at specific actors such as firms have a strong sense of how interfirm networks present important opportunities for understanding how economic activities cut across different geographical scales from the very local to the very global. Today, I'm going to focus on electronics. I use the term global electronics to refer to, if you like, the extremely globalized nature of the electronics industry today. And my focus, for those of you who are more familiar with global production networks, is to try to offer a kind of empirical application of what's called GPN 2.0. There is a version of that in the executive report on the right. You can download from gpn.nus.edu.sg. Essentially, I try to use this industry as an example for us to understand how geographical configurations of electronics GPN are centered on East Asia now, as well as trying to account for those kind of geographical configurations referring back to, if you like, the causal drivers in GPN 2.0. In so doing, project a particular understanding of the world, the kind of world in which economic activities, particularly in production terms, are very much interconnected. That's why I use the term interconnected worlds. Now, moving on to, of course, academic research in this arena, we have a strong sense of the emergence of global value chains research, thanks to, of course, early pioneer like Gary Geographical and others, Tim Surgeon, John Humphrey, and so on. I think it's fair to say this body of work has gained tremendous sort of inroads from early days development studies, economic sociology, to now very much in the fields of regional studies, technology studies, even international business studies are beginning to take strong notice of this body of work. We published a paper recently in JIPS to summarize this entire body of work. So put it in short, I think GVC, GPN researchers approaches are very much interconnected too. Of course, I have a picture to show you. About a year ago, when we have the SASI conference in New York City, when we could still travel, I had specifically met up with Gary, John, and team, and to take a picture to say, hey, you know, GVC, GPN are together. Now, what does GVC research show? I think it's fair to say there are key dimensions in GVC approaches, focusing very much on the governance structures of GVCs, very often at an industry level, focusing on industrial and social upgrading, value capture, including one of the most influential papers in regional studies published in 1992 by John Humphrey and Smith. And of course, in more recent years, there are colleagues in GVC research that focus also on power, Mark Dallas and the rest, and Stefano Ponte. I think they did a paper in the recent issue of a review of international political economy, right? In GPN research, I think many of you probably are familiar, so I shall be very brief. We started off with what's called the Manchester School, GPN 1.0, where we focus on power, embeddedness. Then I think in more recent years, we look into, if you like, the territorial interfaces, where the idea of strategic coupling becomes useful in understanding how regional development can be globalized. We did our special issue in 2009 in regional studies as well, focusing on, if you like, the East Asian perspective of global production networks. In more recent years, I've worked with a NEOCO. We've developed further this line of research in what's called GPN 2.0, in which we have narrowed down the framework to make it more, if you like, causal, to make it more, one may argue, causal mechanism driven. Again, Neil and I have done a special issue in Journal Economic Geography to summarize this line of research, as well as some of the recent studies. Now, on the electronics industry, and of course, broadly conceived the ICT, information communication technology sector, the sort of work done in GPN, GVC is good, but not extremely thick. All right, there are only a few books written. I think Sun and Grimm's paper, book in 2017 with Rowledge on China in electronics GVC is a recent one. Liu Yi at Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, in his recent book, has also a chapter on electronics. But otherwise, I found very few authored books on electronics industry deploying GVC or GPN approaches. There are edited volumes, such as Boris's early work on international production networks, as well as some recent edited books that are looking at electronics value chains in Asia and Eastern Europe. There are many more journal papers, of course, book chapters, but by and large, there is a lack of a full body of work in terms of a monograph and so on. So that's what I'm trying to do in terms of my own work in tackling this line of research. In so doing, trying to, if you like, deploy GPN 2.0 as in Yeung and Yeung 2015 to understand how in the world of electronics, we can see not just global production networks, but very complex interlaces of firm relationship across different geographical scales. Here, of course, we think of global production network as an organizational arrangement. Remember, it's a platform. It's like the backbone of the global economy. But in our GPN 2.0, we look at the global production network very much from a firm's perspective. In other words, lead firm-driven production network. The contemporary global economy, from my perspective, is to see as having multiple worlds of production. This brings me back to Michael Stopper's earlier work, which I discussed a bit in my regional studies annual lecture this year, delivered in April, which is on YouTube and coming out in regional studies, the journal itself. We think of the world as comprising multiple worlds, but these worlds can be stitched together, right, through production level firm relationship. That's really the sort of broad understanding of the world. And of course, there are many sort of world bodies, UNCTAD, World Trade Organization, World Bank, that look into the importance of GVC, GPNs in the post-pandemic world. In GPN 2.0 theory, we focus specifically on how these causal factors on the left, the dynamics such as cost capability ratio, market making imperatives, financial imperatives within the broader risk environment, impact on firms that, of course, are differentiated in terms of different cultures, capacities, technological base, and so on, in turn shape their strategies, intra-firm, inter-firm, and extra-firm relationships to produce uneven geographical outcomes. But for today's purpose, I focus less on the uneven geographical outcomes, but more on electronics industry level dynamics, so to speak. In my other work, I also focus on how you can think of national development. The scale was national in the 2016 book. You can think of national development as a way in which national imperative assets are coupled with global production networks. And that's where the idea of strategic coupling, I argued, serve as, if you like, a mechanism for development. So that development is not just, for example, state-driven domestically, but also how domestic assets couple with GPN imperatives, such as new markets, new technology, even new capital formation, such as if you think of the recent listing of Ant in Hong Kong. Of course, we can also think of changing roles of the state, and capability development among national firms in our region, East Asia, and how this enable East Asian national economies compete in global production networks. And that mechanism, I've described it as strategic coupling in that recent work. So this figure is from the recent annual lecture of the Regional Studies Journal, in which I have focused on how GPN, global production networks in the middle, can help us understand how different regions, regional world A and regional world B, can get interconnected through their participation or leadership in global production networks. So you can think of regional A as more advanced region, regional B as, if you like, the catch-up region, and the two regions get together because of GPNs that connect the various firms and non-firm actors in those regional worlds, A and B, that in turn leads to different outcomes, regional transformations through specialization, and this speaks to the evolutionary economic geography group, as well as a regional transformation through diversification into new industries that otherwise wouldn't be either in existence or strong in regional world B, for example. Again, the full detail of this is in the YouTube video, as well as the paper that has just been accepted, forthcoming with Andras as the commentator. Now, what I'm going to talk about today, in terms of most of the time, is to focus on global electronics centered on East Asia. The idea, of course, is that electronics is so globalized, and yet there is a huge production presence in East Asia, the region in which most of us are, given that this is the kind of Asia version of the RSA webinar today. Okay, let me be brief. First, it's fair to say the ICT hardware, remember, not software, the hardware sector is extremely important. Is in 2000, I mean, the data latest I have is about 2018. 19 is kind of available. 2020, of course, is not over yet. Basically, 2018, one may argue, is the high water of global electronics. Right, for A to Z reasons, you will know a bit more later. In 2018, it's about 2.7 trillion exports in the ICT hardware, 14% worth of global merchandise trade, means non-service trade, which in turn is worth about 23% of world GDP, which is a quarter. So this is a very significant sector in the global economy. What's interesting is that within the ICT hardware export sector, personal computers, PC, and mobile handsets, such as smartphones, the majority, but also featured phones, are the two largest segments in 2018. In other words, these two segments alone constitute a very significant chunk of the ICT hardware as a whole. There are other segments within the electronics industry, such as consumer electronics below, like your TV or many other products, as well as semiconductors, which of course go into personal computers, mobile handsets, and many other products, including toys for your children, right? Will have chips in, and of course in other industry like automotive, aerospace, and so on and so forth. There is also other hardware such as industrial electronics, data storage, and so on. What I'm looking at in today's presentation is very much focusing on PC, mobile handsets, consumer electronics, in particular TV, and semiconductors, very briefly, all right? Now, my research also is dependent on many interviews conducted with some of the largest firms in all of the 4 segments throughout Asia during the 2017-18 period under the auspices of the Global Production Network Center in US. And my dear commentator later, Karen Lai, was one of the founding members of our GPN and US. So it's great to have her commenting on today's presentation. I've interviewed together with colleagues many of the leading firms in PCs, 5 of the top 5, mobile handset, 2 of the top 4, semiconductors, 3 of the top 6 IDM, and 10 of the top 16. So basically, we've spoken to a large number of very influential firms at very high level, at vice president or higher level. Meanwhile, we have also acquired from the IHS market a very large data sets in 2 time period, 2016 and 2019, that will help to sort of underscore some of the data that I'm going to show you later on. But for today's presentation, I can go into great empirical detail, and hence I see Yeung as one of our participants, and she has the unfortunate task of reading the manuscript that has all the empirical data in it. So basically, I've got a lot of empirical material which I've used for a forthcoming book contracted with Stanford University Press, aiming for late next year publication. I'm revising it right now for the hopefully the final round. Is with this same title as today's presentation. Now, let me just give you some broad numbers, all right? If you think of mobile handset, all right, means smartphones and feature phones. I only go up to 2018, whereby you will know that Samsung, Huawei, Apple, Xiaomi, China, Oppo are some of the leading players. And if you look at some of these leading players, what's interesting is to say, apart from Samsung, which basically produce everything in-house, vast majority in Vietnam, all right, the rest are highly outsourced, with the exception of Oppo. But if you look at Huawei, Apple, 100% outsourced, and Xiaomi, the vast majority of their production will be done in China, as well as in Huawei's case, also in India. So what's interesting, if you look at the mobile handset segment in 2018, is that apart from Samsung, to a certain extent specializing in assembly in Vietnam, the vast majority will have China, India, as well as other locations. All right, other locations such as Brazil, Indonesia, some in South Korea as well. So in the mobile handset industry, segment is fairly sort of regionalized, if not globalized. Meanwhile, if you look at personal computers, all right, I differentiate between desktop and notebooks. If you look at the combined numbers, the top 6 players again, HP, Lenovo, Dell, Acer, Asus, and Apple. The top 6 is worth about 82% of the market share, right? And many of us are buying computers during this COVID period, as you know. Interestingly, if you look at notebook production, NB, China has overwhelming dominance. Basically, the vast majority of the notebooks in 2018 would have been assembled by Taiwanese original design manufacturers in whether Eastern Coast or in Chongqing and Sichuan area. But if you look at desktop production, all right, it's much more sort of globalized. You will see that there is a great deal of in-house production. For example, Lenovo does a bit of this. Dell also does a bit of in-house for desktop, spreaded both in China as well as in Mexico. So if you look at HP, same thing, all right? Desktop, China is only 4.9 million units and Mexico is 10.9 million, of course, exporting to North American market. In other words, in terms of PC, with the exception of notebook, if you look at desktop, it's fairly globalized. TV production. Now, TV is one of the major consumer electronic product now. Again, if you look at the top players, Samsung, LG, followed by mostly China, as well as Sony from Japan, all right? So these are the leading brands. However, in terms of industry concentration, the top 6 is only about 56%, meaning this segment is very diversified, all right? There are many smaller players. In-house production tends to be more prevalent. In other words, most of the brands, with the exception of Sony, assemble their own TVs, and this go all the way to the biggest TV screens. And if you look at production, again, China is very significant. So is Eastern Europe, Latin America. So TV is quite heavy. You can imagine that for the final assembly of TV, there is a great deal of global production, so to speak. So this just gives you some sense of the numbers. If you look at semiconductor, this is the last one. And just for simplistic purpose, I shall just focus on the 2018 capacity, means in each of the national economies, US, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, how big, how much wafer, will be fabricated in those national economies. The biggest will be Taiwan, about I think this is in million wafers per month, all right? 8-inch equivalent, 4 million. South Korea next, followed by Japan. As you can tell, the three are already extremely big. US is about 1.7, followed by, of course, China before the US, if you like, 2 million. And now Europe and Singapore are relatively smaller, all right? So if you think of wafer fabrication, East Asia is extremely dominant in terms of production of the wafers from which the chips will be extracted. Now, in terms of the interview material, I look at all the 41 lead firms we've interviewed. We've managed to extract from the 41 lead firms about 455 manufacturing facilities worldwide, 387 R&D facilities, and about 2,000 sales and marketing offices. And that will be the kind of locational presence we can identify. Of course, given the nature of the study, we are unable to tell how significant would be each of those 455 manufacturing facilities. We only know there is one in which location. There is a great deal of geographical concentration of electronics manufacturing in Northeast Asia, particularly in China. I think that's no surprise to many of you there. There is quite a significant presence of Southeast Asia as well in terms of manufacturing activities. But if you look at semiconductor fabs, means the manufacturing of chips, then it's fairly spread out in East Asia, Western Europe, and the US. In other words, only in semiconductor manufacturing, you will see significant presence of Europe and the US. Why? So there are few strategies that, as we know, lead firms in GPN adopt. One is intra-firm coordination through internalization of production, right? So earlier I've given you some hints why certain lead firms have gone internal, meaning try to assemble and produce its own electronics devices, sometimes for better cost control or faster market responsiveness. This particular quotation from OEM, one of the largest leading brand names in the world, has given us good sense that we can save additional costs associated with vertical integration because of the time saved when we innovate in that sense. So the idea is that if you can control production in your own, through your intra-firm networks, you can innovate faster and presumably reduce inventory costs because you can get production moving faster, and in so doing, achieving greater competitiveness. If you look at semiconductors, again, the idea of vertical control is important, very much in the integrated device manufacturers we call IDMs, which may have strong what's called dependency factors. The idea is that they don't want to depend on the arbitration by, if you like, the fab suppliers such as TSMC, UMC, or Global Foundries. So if you have vertical control of your own technology through your own fabs, you will achieve advantage in that way instead of relying on the allocation from TSMC, UMC, and so on. So that's the reason for internalization. In terms of customer relationship, there is a great deal of relationship developed between lead firms and their long-term customers. Again, the kind of inter-firm relationships developed through a partnership becomes very significant. There is a great deal of customization of joint development of facilities by, if you like, ODM suppliers to, say, notebook producers, and so on and so forth. A relationship with key suppliers are also very strategic in nature. Very often is to lower costs, faster time to market, to achieve lower costs and faster time to market, or because lead firms sometimes are also dependent on the certain kind of technology from the suppliers, and hence developing strong strategic partnership relationships. So going back to the four main drivers in GPN 2.0 theory, the four causal drivers, if you like: cost capability ratio, market and risk, and financialization and risk. Let me briefly mention cost capability ratio, whereby I think the findings from my study on global electronics is that lead firms are very concerned with total cost of ownership, what's called the total cost of ownership, in which supply capability become very important. In other words, if supply capability is strong, even costs may be slightly higher in particular location, you will still achieve good cost capability ratio, lower cost capability ratio. Market imperative is very important in certain kind of lead firms because, as one again OEM brand name OEM mentioned, in the case of China, for example, the more sophisticated manufacturing becomes, the closer you have to be to the market. This is because there is no differentiation in cost. Nobody invests in China anymore to do low-cost manufacturing. You invest in China to reach the market, that's what you do. And they have significant presence in China for those reasons. It's not just because China has cheap labor. Actually, labor is no longer cheap in China, all right? But the market imperative becomes very important. Third, financial discipline. Now, this is a factor that's relatively harder to sort of show empirically. So in my research, it seems to me the most significant segment in global electronics susceptible to financial discipline is semiconductors because of the capital intensity required in this particular industry. Look at one example. No, this is the risk. Okay, so the idea of a financial market pressure on semiconductors is that for wafer fabrication, you need to invest billions of dollars to build fabs, and hence the kind of financial returns and pressures from capital market become very influential in shaping how certain firms decide to outsource or in production to, say, TSMC or build their own fab. So you might have heard of Intel is likely to outsource more of its graphics chips, not processor, but graphics chips to TSMC. That's one example, all right? Risk mitigation is a very important factor in GPN 2.0, in which we focus on many risks, but for my study, I focus on environmental and regulatory risks. Regulatory will be the sort of geopolitical risk you're thinking of, all right? So if you think of one of the examples I've given you is actually it's American leading chip company. I won't mention which one. The Chief Supply Chain Officer, CEO, mentioned that risk, they have basically spread out their fabs, not just in the US, but also in Asia. But I can't mention which location, or else you will know which firm already. And to this Chief Supply Chain Officer, risk mitigation through the distributed network will be as geographically centric as they would like. So they distribute their fabs in such a way to mitigate against major geopolitical risks. And this compared to, for example, Samsung, Hynix, and Toshiba, these are memory chip makers. They are heavily concentrated in their home economy. Samsung and SK Hynix in Korea, Toshiba in Japan. So in conclusion, my study of the global electronics industry has demonstrated, of course, interconnected worlds with regard to the US, Western Europe, and East Asia. But that interdependencies vary, if you like, across PCs, mobile handsets, TV, and semiconductors. In terms of the importance of the four drivers, I will say cost capability ratios are most important in the final end product segments, right? PCs, handsets, and TV. So in other words, reducing cost over capability. High capability, low cost will be the ideal solution for PC, handset, and TV makers. The market is important to mobile handsets, important to TV, and hence you need to locate near to the market. But for PC, in particular notebook, is less critical because, again, of the ease at which notebook PC can be transported through air transportation. In terms of financial discipline, notebook PC maker seems to be undergoing some major financial pressures, less so for mobile handsets and TV, but very much in semiconductors. In terms of risk, again, you can imagine because of tremendous capital intensity and sunk costs, semiconductor firms see risk as tremendously important in shipping their GPN configurations. So what are the major implications from this kind of study? I think first is to say, it's fair to expect in the next 10 years, there is still a great deal of regional divisions of labor with strong production and market orientation in East Asia, whatever comes out of today's election, so to speak. Second is that the development of ecosystem in supporting, if you like, production network become critical in, if you like, resilience and retention of production network. One may argue logistical support as well as supply networks are critical in this total ownership cost approach. In other words, high logistics and supplier availability lead to lower cost capability ratios. And that's the reason why China remains extremely attractive even today. As of today means literally today. Third, you will have heard many defensive policy interventions, for example, from the US, export restrictions on Huawei, and so on, and semiconductors. Basically, many of these policy interventions eventually will harm many of the key suppliers in those production networks, including many American firms themselves. And I will argue that those policies are not very effective in achieving the end goal, so to speak. Finally, changing market dynamics are very important in light of current pandemic and, of course, the economic happenings to come in the next few years. There may be severe recession and so on and so forth that will lead to significant market shifts. And how to deal with all these uncertainties may lead to more distributed GPNs or more streamlined, regionalized global production networks. We shall see. So that's all from me today. And these are some of the key references. Thank you for your participation and listening, and I shall be ready to handle any of the questions later on. Passing back to Tom.
Thank you very much, Henry, for that fascinating talk. I think it's a very fascinating time to be thinking about global production and global production networks right now, and given the sort of the turbulent moment that we're in. So thanks for starting the conversation off. And so we are now going to give about 7 minutes or so. Henry, you were even slightly early, so we've got a little bit of time flexibility, but around 7 or so minutes to Karen Lai to provide a response to Henry. So please take it away, Karen.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for the presentation from Henry just now. And I'll just offer a couple of comments in response to what Henry has said in his presentation, but also offer maybe a few thoughts for perhaps stretching some of our thinking about the GPNs of global electronics, particularly for East Asia. I think for some of us who kind of grew up on an intellectual diet of things like developmental state or new international division of labor literature, I think what has been presented is quite a far cry from some of those classic conceptualizations of how East Asia fits into the global system, right, in terms of capital or technology, labor or consumer markets. And certainly, I think this body of work has really influenced and reshaped how we are thinking about what's driving global production and consumption dynamics on both regional and global scales. I think one thing I want to particularly pick up on from one of Henry's slides was kind of the role of risk, conceptualization of risk. And in the risk column, for instance, I think it's in one of the later slides on a table, I think it's 6.7, where we had a different columns about financial discipline, and then there's a column on risk. And I just find it, quite surprising that it looks as if, under the risk column seems to have surprisingly low, or relative to the other columns, lower impact as key drivers. And I was also just wondering on a broader sense, maybe conceptually, do we need to unpack, risk a bit more in GPN analysis? Because that's something I've not been seeing a lot. Generally, this comment might have been made in other commentaries as well, whether it's aspects such as environmental risks, geopolitical risks, although Henry hinted a little bit at that in the last slide, or reputational risk as well is something that is increasingly relevant and important. So whether we want to think a bit further about the idea of risk in GPN studies, not least in global electronics. In terms of some further comments to kind of stretch our thinking about electronics and GPN in East Asia, I just want to kind of bring in the impacts of fintech on thinking about electronics industry, and particularly for East Asia as well. So the first kind of point I want to highlight on this is, thinking about the impacts of fintech on supply chain financing, for instance, and whether there is a potential in changing, right, the relationship between firms and a reliance on bank financing or debt issuance or capital markets for their financing needs. And I think this is particularly pertinent for small and medium-sized enterprises in terms of how they might be able to reposition themselves through being able to access alternative financing. So the new models of online supply chain financing, for instance, through providing loans via e-commerce platforms like Alibaba, for instance. So we know that traditionally, because of factors like low transaction volume, they have very limited collateral or short operating histories, SMEs don't often meet the credit criteria for many kind of bank internal procedures. But on the other hand, for e-commerce platforms that are now extending into loans and supply chain financing, they have a lot of proprietary information like transactional data in terms of volume, service reliability, reviews of users and buyers and so on that could be used in conjunction with or in place of limited credit data to evaluate these firms. And so I do start to wonder, would better access to financing start to reshape some of these smaller players in terms of their attitudes towards risk associated with co-development of products and technologies with other firms, and whether that could then influence their modes of strategic coupling with other firms and impacts on certain localities. Another point I wanted to highlight is in terms of the blurring boundary between production and finance in global electronics. So one of the cases that I've been reading about, Foxconn, certainly very familiar in Henry's work on electronics, one of the world's largest contract manufacturer of consumer electronics, through its e-commerce platform is, I think, starting to reshape interfirm networks and certain aspects of power relations in providing loans and financial guarantees, right? It's an extension of its work. And it is able to do so by leveraging on its existing business relationships and close knowledge of supply business operations and their financial status. So because these firms already have to meet quite strict criteria to become qualified suppliers of Foxconn, so Foxconn is able to lower its credit risk that way in engaging with, offering those kinds of loans and guarantees. So, and I do start to wonder whether this integration of supply chain financing and B2B transaction via the e-commerce platform is increasing the power of Foxconn in shaping those broader supply networks, other than just its role as a contract manufacturer, right, in the production of material commodities. So rather than focusing on how firms create or enhance value through, let's say, improving manufacturing processes, labor efficiencies, or acquiring new technologies, which we see in kind of classic GPN analysis, firms are also developing new forms of competitive advantages, right? For instance, in financing or data intelligence, because a lot of the online transactions that we're seeing are producing massive amounts of data, which are being used for algorithmic analysis, which could be mobilized by technology firms, or in this case, let's say tech divisions of other companies, to generate other kinds of fine-grained information that could be useful for new market segments. So in the Foxconn example, in this instance, we are seeing some firms that are becoming financial actors as well as being so-called productive ones through developing new fintech solutions. So, and I think it's important, this point is important not just because that these firms are providing new forms of revenue by providing an additional service, but it's about locking in their suppliers and their users through a growing ecosystem of business and financial services for these Foxconn suppliers, which then could bolster the kind of network power and market position of Foxconn. So I guess I'm trying to highlight whether fintech could present new opportunities for thinking about new modes of value creation, value enhancement, and firm upgrading in that sense. And the final point I want to make is about questioning lead firm in GPN analysis. So some of the examples that we've been looking at is about mobilizing key advantages, right, in certain manufacturing processes or technologies. But whether a lead firm could position themselves as a platform-based intermediary with competitive advantages and assets in data and algorithms, rather than just an owner of capital or employer of labor or even owner of certain technologies. And this is particularly obvious, I think, if we look at the leading fintech giants. We commonly call them GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, and BAT, right, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. So these these big tech firms are acting as platforms that uses digital infrastructure to collect and analyze data and in order to extract value as well from intermediation. So if we think about the platform in this sense as becoming an increasingly important business model, then should we also think about its impacts on firm and consumer behavior, on labor markets and the organization of global production, and who might be the winners and losers of such a process? So I would argue that these technology firms are no longer just niche players in technology or in finance or in retail, but they're beginning to operate across a lot of these traditional industry segments. And in that sense, perhaps we need to think about, are there new modes of cultivating and capturing value compared to what we currently look at in GPN analysis? And that maybe the next big story for production networks in East Asia might be that of production platforms, with the emergence of new lead firms and reconfiguring industry practices and market power through the increased relevance of some of these big tech firms that are also related to global electronics, but in new ways. So I'll leave it there for further reflection and discussion.
Thanks very much, Karen, for those interesting thoughts around platforms and financialization. And so I wonder, Henry, given that in fact, Henry, you've gone and answered some of the questions in the Q&A box, I wonder if you might spend a bit of time responding to Karen's comments.
Thanks, Karen, and for very, very relevant questions that will spur certainly a future research in not just electronics, but many other areas. I think essentially we will focus on three key pointers. One is about risk, two is about, if you like, finance and fintech. Three is about, one may argue, new technology platforms in shaping GPN dynamics. I may not be able to answer all three well, but I shall be just brief in dealing with each of them just to give each of us some hints. I think when it comes to risk, going beyond what has been described in the original book, 2015, we have actually 5 different risk categories, including, of course, economic risks, technological risks, and so on and so forth. But of course, that is a theoretical work. The empirical applications depends on the particular industry and or phenomenon. I think it's fair to say, I've seen quite some recent publications in various journals as well, that there is a great deal of emphasis on risk. Remember, risk is supposed to be calculatable, if you like, events, right, that will shape how firms as actors and we as individuals perform our economic roles. So risk in itself is not the driver, all right? Risk cannot be the explanation of outcomes, mainly because a firm that cannot, if you like, reduce its cost capability ratio, improve its market, and or respond effectively to financialization, even though you can minimize risk, that doesn't mean you will be successful as a competitor. That's why in our work, with by ours means Ko and Yeung, we've argued that the other 3 are the causal drivers, but risks serve as the environment that can shape how each of these causal drivers, or in combination, will work in driving particular production network configuration. So it's in that sense that risk is important. And by the way, risk is always there. It's not just, it happens to be much more risky today. But then, hey, if you think a few years ago, nobody would have known the world so risky as of now, right? So that's on the risk side. Fintech, I think it's fair to say, very important, no doubt about it. And of course, the point about Foxconn helping out the suppliers in these particular difficult times to ensure supply chain stability, so on and so forth, is extremely important. I think there is more research that needs to be done on this. I've not seen that many empirical work giving details of how fintech, as well as financial sort of relationship between, if you like, first tier and second tier supply work out, at least in the literature that I'm familiar with. So basically, I can only say that it's important, but much more empirical is needed to elaborate on that. The third point about platform technology underscoring current future production network, I think Gernot Graeber has a recent EPA, what's that called, exchange piece that focused quite a bit on it. I think Jamie Peck is writing a commentary for sociological something. I've seen the piece, but I forgot the journal title. with Gernot as well, that comment on this idea of platforms, as well as Martin Kemeny, my editor at the Stanford University Press book series. So platforms are very important, but personally, I have great difficulty of separating, if you like, Apple as a platform, which we know, the iTunes platform, if you like, and Apple as a hardware producer. They are integrated, right? So is Google. Google also has hardware, but of course, it's a big platform. So currently, I can't really separate the two well conceptually to respond effectively in a few minutes. I need hours to discuss this. So it's a very important question. Both conceptual and empirical work must be done. More needs to be done. But there is, I think, currently too much platform talk, too little platform GPN complex that needs to be unpacked. Thank you.
Thanks again very much, Henry. So we've got a couple of extra minutes. Karen, I don't know if you want to, sort of carry on the discussion, or if you feel like you've kind of said what you wanted to say. But in principle, Karen, you could ask a more pointed question, or make a comment, or whatever you like. So I invite you to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to follow on from some of the response that Henry provided, for instance. So I think you're right. We do see, let's say, a company like Apple that is involved in platform economies, but also involved in in production, right, in the classic sense. But we also are seeing other big tech companies that are purely platform-based companies that are slowly moving, let's say Google, right? That are moving into some aspects of hardware, mainly as part of that ecosystem, approach to lock in consumers. So yeah, I agree that we're seeing different models going on, and it will be interesting and important to see how these different models and different cases, right, work out in spatial terms as well, in terms of their impacts on markets, on production, and so on. If I may maybe raise one final question for Henry to reflect on, I wonder if you could say something about the role of non-state and non-firm actors in some of these East Asia electronics GPN that you've been talking about, because I think that didn't come through very much in the presentation time that you had.
Yeah, unfortunately, in my research itself, I've not focused too much on that. And of course, one of the question asked about sustainability. As I reply, my research partner has looked a great deal more into it in terms of corporate social responsibility, as well as environmental initiatives by the other group. So, and Carlo at the Queen Mary now. So basically, all the non-firm actors are extremely important, particularly when it comes to coming down to, if you like, the development outcome side of the story. So what I've done today is really just to unpack the GPN dynamics part of the story, and to connect that to development outcomes. You necessarily have to look at non-firm actors, almost by definition. So in that sense, that I've not dealt with it at all here. Nor in the forthcoming book, so don't expect much talk about that. I was focusing primarily on unpacking the GPN itself, which I think is important to get that done. Before then, we talked about all sorts of development outcome. I have a forthcoming exchange piece in the EPA. It's a bit naughty with the title called, what was it called? The Trouble with Global Production Networks. So look out for that. Basically, I make a plea for all GPNers, GPN researchers. As much as we would love to study local and regional outcomes, it's important also to unpack the network box as well. So the trouble with GPN is that we have done too little in unpacking the network. We've talked a lot about, labor, development, environmental, upgrading outcomes. Sometimes it's hard to tell what network dynamics are you referring to. So that's my sort of a counter response to that particular point. Very important point Karen raised.
Thank you, Henry. So I want to bring this session to a close, first of all, by thanking Henry and Karen for wonderful presentation and a great response and an interesting discussion there at the end. I know that we'll look forward, Henry, to your book and some of the other pieces that you mentioned. So on behalf of all of the participants, I want to thank you very much to both of the speakers. We're going to have a break for about 5 minutes, but I do, those of you on the call, I want to remind you that another session is starting in 5 minutes. It's a panel session called The Gap of Understanding the Belt and Road Initiative between Chinese and Western Scholars. So it's sure to be interesting, so please do stick around. And that's starting in just 5 minutes. But in the meanwhile, thanks very much to the speakers.
I would just like to add my thanks to those of Tom Kemeny for the speakers. And also I'd like to say thank you to Jessie Poon for her introduction. Wonderful discussion this morning. So refreshingly normal at a time that is very not normal. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second panel, The Gap of Understanding the BRI between Chinese and Western Scholars. My name is Cheng from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this panel on behalf of Professor Wai-chung, the chair of RSA China. So I have some really big shoes to fill. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the RSA Members Lounge. I'm delighted to present a fantastic group of scholars joining us today. Before that, I thought a paper led by Professor Liu from 2018, which closely analyzed the progress of BRI-related research so far, might be useful in putting this panel in perspective. You could look it up later on the Journal of Geographical Sciences, but briefly here, its finding shows a very interesting pattern of research focus among scholars from different backgrounds. Many international scholars pay critical attention to issues such as geopolitical intentions, environmental impact, debt and financing models of infrastructure, etc. Whereas Chinese scholars seem more interested in interpreting BRI's meaning and trying to understand its implication processes and risks. I can't think of a better occasion than today's panel to reflect on this apparent gap of subjectivity and objectivity around BRI research. So I will briefly introduce our speakers before inviting them to speak for 10 minutes each. After that, we will have a discussion. For housekeeping, please use the Q&A box in order to ask questions for the speakers. You can also upvote questions by giving them a thumbs up. Our first speaker is Professor Xiangming Chen, who is the founding dean and director of the Center for Urban and Global Studies at Trinity College in Connecticut, the US, and the Paul Rather Distinguished Professor of Global Urban Studies and Sociology, as well as a distinguished guest professor at Fudan University in Shanghai. He received his BA from Beijing Foreign Studies University and his PhD from Duke University. He is a prolific author and has edited numerous books that are now classics in global urban studies. Most recently, he is the lead author of the Belt and Road Initiative as Epical Regionalization, published by RSA this year. However, due to the time difference, we will hear from Professor Chen via a recorded presentation. After Professor Chen is Dr. Xiao Han. Dr. Han's research interest includes China's rural changes, the Chinese go out, the technopolitics of water infrastructure, and the political economy of development. She is working as a team member to investigate the nature and impacts of the restructuring of China's agriculture and rural society. Her PhD project investigated the goals, practices, and consequences of Chinese overseas dam building with a focus on Ghana. I have the pleasure of sharing my first name with Xiao's surname in Roman alphabet. So for this panel, we have to become experts in professional disambiguation. Last but not least, we have Dr. Woon. Dr. Woon is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore. His research interests include geographies of peace and nonviolence, post-colonial geographies, and issues related to war, security, and terrorism. Currently, he's examining the geopolitical implications of China's rise, contextualizing such debates through BRI and China's ongoing interest and interventions in the Arctic region. I'm sure our audience is as keen as I am to hear more from each of them. So, Dr. Xiaohan, are you there? Could you go first?
Sure. So I have a few slides, so I'll use the share screen. Hello everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Thanks RSA and Professor Liu for having me here, and thanks Chen for chairing this panel. So I'm a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, Australia, but I just left Australia a few days ago, so I'm now in a quarantine hotel in Guangzhou. Apologize first. My internet connection might not be very stable. So anyway, so beyond my narrow focus, my personal focus on dams and the water sector, and before going into the details of understanding the Belt Road Initiative between Chinese and the Western scholars, I'd like to share you roughly first how many BRI-themed articles have been published in Chinese and English languages, and what about. So, okay, I need to minimize the videos. As you can see, the number in the red circle. So in the Chinese National Knowledge Infrastructure CNKI database, there are more than 63,000 journal articles themed on the BRI. That's a lot. And of this body of literature, the 5 most cited papers are about, as you can see, scientific understanding of the Belt Road Initiative. That's quite a general macro one, and about regional economic cooperation, about national strategies, and trade. The 4th and 5th are both about trade. So, and then in terms of publication date, well, as you can see, in the past 2 days, at least 7 new ones published. At least 7, because my screenshot only allows me to get 5 items to make them readable. Well, I'd also like to note that, please see item number 2, for example. For this paper, the Belt Road Initiative is more like the background, while the article examines the ways to create or improve the employment competitiveness of college and universities graduates in Chongqing, China. So in my view, this is not really much about Belt Road Initiative, or questionable about to what extent it's about the Belt Road Initiative. Anyway, so in an article published earlier this year, Professor Liu Weidong and his colleague counted that by mid-2019, there were more than 56,000 BRI-themed articles published in Chinese language. As we saw, now the number is over 63,000. So it's like about 7,000 articles published in a little bit more than a year time. That's such a boom. Anyway, so as Liu and Yao, they noted, these papers, only 1/5 of these Chinese papers are published in core journals. That's known as the kind of good journals in Chinese. But these papers are mostly about macro analysis, about strategies and discourses, lacking fieldwork-based case studies. If you can read in Chinese, they explain more in detail. So accordingly, Professor Liu and his colleagues contribute a special issue of Belt Road Initiative case studies, which is so far the most comprehensive contribution, collection of BRI case studies in Chinese that I am aware. These articles include very rich empirical details, mostly about railways, as you can see, and about industrial parks or say special economic zones, mainly in Africa and Asia. How about English literature? Taking the Web of Science database as example, so far, 726 publications included, of which 660 journal articles. Comparing with the number of Chinese publications, that's not much. Then, what topic or what kind of, well, it's not a perfect typology, but at least give us a kind of general impression about what these papers are about. Environmental sciences, international relations, economics, area studies, etc. However, of these 660 pieces of papers, about 2/3 published by scholars from PRC, or at least currently affiliated with mainland Chinese universities or research institutions. This is a special note. Okay, and also in English, there are several, these are mostly relating to my area. So I'm aware there are BI themed special issues on financing, that's in Eurasian geography and economics, organized by Karen, and politics and space, published in EPC, and also economics of the BRI, that's published in the Journal of Development Economics, and views from the ground, that's a special issue published in Political Geography, focusing on the practices, on-ground practices of Chinese or BRI-related projects. There are many other special issues published in English. So, in terms of gaps of understanding the Belt Road Initiative, personally, I would avoid separating Chinese and Western scholars, because like for me, I'm Chinese, but I also publish in English and work with Western scholars, sorry. Anyways, mainly I'd like to highlight 3 gaps I'm aware in existing literature. Precisely, the first and the foremost one for me is about the definition and positioning of the Belt Road Initiative. That's like, what is the Belt Road Initiative and what are Belt Road Initiative projects? Sometimes answers to these questions reflect gaps of understandings between Chinese host country and other international players, sometimes among scholars themselves. There's no problem of having various definitions of the BRI, but when we talk about it, it was noting that there may be differences between the Chinese version, the Chinese understanding of Belt Road Initiative and certain host country players. Also, is China itself a Belt Road Initiative country? If China is a Belt Road Initiative member country, in what ways and to what extent China's role is different from other Belt Road Initiative member countries? So as far as I know, China officially positions itself as a Belt Road Initiative member country. But when I talk to non-Chinese scholars, most of them won't think that way. Second, there is a concern about data and the database. So like Chinese literature contains details from Chinese sources but lack fieldwork, as previously mentioned. And also there relatively little about host country and other host country and other international actors about how they think and how they react to the Belt Road Initiative. Well, about like in English literature generally, there is insufficient attention paid to the practices of Chinese actors and the details about their overseas activities, especially the interplay between Chinese government and Chinese companies. Like a quote from Henry's GPN work, lack of understanding of Chinese inter-firm and intra-firm relations. I think this is partly due to the lack of access to contacts in China for like Western and other international scholars. There is also an issue with database. Like in China, there is the official data, but rarely compatible with others. And outside China, there are a database published by Western scholars, mainly, for example, there is the database published by the China Africa Research Initiative in Johns Hopkins University. And that's mainly focused on Chinese investment or Chinese engagement in Africa. And also there is China's Global Power Database. This is like focused on energy sector about Chinese engagement in building power plants overseas. That's published by scholars in Boston University. And also NGOs sometimes are active. For example, a bit earlier, environmental NGO International Rivers published a big database about Chinese investment or involvement in building overseas dams. But this database was a bit problematic, and Deborah Brotgam, she published an article criticized this database. That's something else. Third, what I want to highlight is the level of engaging with critical theories and critical perspective varies. So there are very good and insightful BRI study, Belt Road Initiative studies published in both Chinese and English language, but these are relatively separate bodies of literature. Mainly the Chinese literature, the good ones at least, include rich details about how the Chinese government and Chinese companies promote and implement particular infrastructure projects under or say relating to the Belt Road Initiative. But their level of engagement with critical theoretical debates can be improved, in my view. Conceptually, it's about the so what question and the ways in which we think about the Belt Road Initiative. About English publications, that's kind of more diverse in terms of topics, mainly relating to politics or the political character of the Belt Road Initiative, and more diverse in terms of geographical focus. There are studies published or on the way about, for example, financial geography of the Belt Road Initiative, as mentioned in Karen's work, technopolitics and knowledge politics relating to the Belt Road Initiative, and kind of more specifically, critical remote sensing, that's Mia's work. She will chair the next session, and about dams and hydropolitics and the assemblage of infrastructure projects. This include my own and my colleagues' work. But again, it's very hard to categorize as by Chinese or Western scholars, I think both. Amongst non-Chinese academic work, as far as I know, there are also people working on interesting topics in Latin America and other Africa and Asian countries that are not frequently mentioned in Chinese literature. So lastly, what I want to stress is that in terms of the Belt Road Initiative, particularly the planning and the implementation of specific infrastructure projects, host country actors are really important. Both Chinese and Western scholars should pay more attention to them and the host country actors' behavior, or say the interplay entanglements between the Chinese host country and other international players. Yeah, that's it for from me today. Thanks again for the organization of events like this panel, so that scholars from different places and with different backgrounds can have a platform or a chance to dialogue. Thank you. I'll just finish.
Thank you, Dr. Han.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to try to go straight into Professor Chen's recording. Let's see if the tech works this time.
Good afternoon to all of you in Beijing and elsewhere, or together in person and virtually. Sorry I cannot join you in real time. I thank the RSA for organizing this event, and the local organizers, the other panelists, and Professor Wai-chung for including me. I hope my recorded remarks will complement the other panelists and contribute something useful to this topic. As the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has gained global traction and local implementation, it has generated a large and growing body of published research. This work stems from and cuts across diverse national contexts, disciplinary domains, and types of research institutions and individual scholars. The published research is scattered across many academic and trade books, scholarly papers, and policy reports. My preliminary research put the number of both books and reports in English at about 50, although I focus on journal articles here. In a chapter published in 2019, Vespisi and 3 others identified 155 research papers extracted from Scopus, Science Direct, and the Web of Science databases. Figure 1, so I bring it up here. Slide 1 shows that of the 155 papers through 2018, 33, 32, and 24 we published in the areas of economics, international relations, and environmental sciences, respectively. The survey also shows that a total of 32 peer-reviewed research papers were published in 10 important journals, such as Journal of Contemporary China, Third World Quarterly, Geopolitics, and Eurasian Geography and Economics. While the authors were distributed globally, those affiliated with Chinese universities and research institutions appeared more active and represented. The publication on the BRI reflects its broad geographic scope and wide range of topics, including geopolitical competition, project financing, energy security, economic integration, and border dynamics. This scatter-plot research stretched out further as the BRI gained greater global interest and led to more completed and new projects located in more places. It is clear that the lagging research at the beginning of BRI gradually caught up. More research, however, does not necessarily mean greater clarity about the movement and trajectory of the literature in terms of where progress has been made and what gaps remain. One indicator of progress is the growing number of papers appearing in high-quality journals. This has laid further ground for a good stock-picking effort by William, Robinson, and Bozarovsky in their article in the Geographical Analysis in early 2020. Slide 2, or Table 1 in their paper, offers a summary classification of 4 main research themes and a distribution of mostly journal articles across these themes. Of the around 50 publications listed in the right column, geopolitics and political economy account for about 35, while the cultural and environmental categories contain the remaining 15. I hope you can see it clearly. The environmentally focused papers appear to weigh comparably as in slide 1 relative to the other topics. The dominance of the first 2 themes makes a lot of sense, as the BRI has attracted and sustained the interest of international relations and macro-political economy scholars since the outset. This is largely why the 3 authors call for a more nuanced analysis of the BRI's spatial and scalar politics. 2, approaching the BRI as a distinctively urban question. And 3, a disruption of the dominant China-centric discussions through critical, in-depth case studies. I agree with and applaud their call for addressing these as gaps in the BRI research. There has been a recent echo to this advocated urban turn in a special issue on the BRI in political geography and a set of collected papers in Eurasian geography and economics earlier in 2020. The guest editorial for the special issue Political Geography stated, "We examine the BRI as a relational contested process, a bundle of intertwined discourses, policies, and projects that sometimes align but are sometimes contradictory. We move beyond policy level, macroeconomic, and classic geopolitical analysis to study China's global investments from the ground up." These two collections of papers share a focus on borderlands between China and its neighbors or near abroad. While the papers cover different borderlands, one paper in both collections addressed the China-Central Asia borders to reflect a strong Eurasian focus. These papers display a new shift to the BRI as an urban question from a transnational cross-border perspective. I also see this as a double turn of the BRI research to the urban as a grounded focus and to the borderland as a regional scale analysis. These borderlands contain varied subnational parts of China and the neighboring and closely involved BRI countries that bear the first and full brunt of BRI's spatial spillovers. Another feature of these most recent papers is that the authors are almost exclusively Western. I see it as another improvement in the sense that these scholars see the BRI as both a critical global phenomenon and analytical lens with which to engage a variety of relevant cases of both historical and contemporary importance. This also points to a key challenge that the scholarly community must respond. It pertains to the BRI's short duration since 2013, following earlier research on China's global rise on one hand. On the other hand, the BRI falls between that research and the new phase of research in the wake of the pandemic in 2020. Since China's global policy predated the BRI by a dozen years, a large number of China's overseas projects implemented before 2013 have been retroactively counted as part of the BRI. This challenges researchers to address both continuities and shifts in state policy, empirical development, and corresponding research questions from pre-2013 to post-2013. For example, one paper in the Political Geography special issue on Law's Northern Economic Corridor, which started in early 2000s, engages the scholarships on infrastructure, transnational development, and the BRI in an integrated fashion. The pandemic, in conjunction with other global dynamics, such as the US-China trade war, are prompting the BRI research to anticipate a potential new phase. The pandemic also challenges us to recognize the sequential fluid logic undergirding the BRI and adjust our research orientation and strategy with new developments and impacts of different scales. As a roadmap that traces backwards and points forward, I have compiled a schematic table that cross-tabulizes the three phases BRI-related research by three spatial focuses on the global/national, regional, and urban respectively. Slide 3 conveys a sense of continued and shifted research themes through the three phases, columns 1 through 3. The basic thread of the research on China's rise, or global China, began before the BRI and has sustained its prominence due to the BRI's magnified influence through the post-2013 phase, or BRI Research 1.0. It will undoubtedly continue through what I see as the BRI Research 2.0 through the post-2020 phase. The recent scholarship referred above has begun to shift the heavy focus on Role A down to the urban scale in Role C. As expected, this welcome shift passed through and intersected with the in-between regional scale, Role B, as exemplified by the strong focus on China's borderlands. The regional scale itself also deserves a greater emphasis in research, as the BRI's impact grows via 6 regional transborder corridors and their subcorridors. The new RSA policy impact book, I recently authored with 2 other scholars, focuses on 3 of these corridors with an extended analysis of a few key cities as anchors, gateways, and hubs of various kinds. Slide 3 also aims to direct research to the connections and shifts between the cells along the 3 roads. It calls for making sense of factors that drive 1A toward 2A and 3A by studying 4A more carefully, for example. The same is true of all the cells that intersect between rows B and C and the 4 columns. This framing bridges the pre-BRI scholarship forward to the growing BRI-specific research and onto a new phase on the post-pandemic BRI. Column 4 identifies a few general themes that reflect the cumulative progression of research from the pre-BRI through the post-BRI phase to how the pandemic may influence BRI's trajectory going forward. Slide 3 has another purpose for advancing BRI research by highlighting the content of each cell and its positional fit in the broader framing. It encouraged the BRI research to connect with a variety of topics that can illuminate important questions about the BRI and be enlightened by the processes and outcomes the BRI has set in motion. I give one brief illustration for each of the 3 analytical skills across the 3 rows. First, the pandemic has added a public health dimension to the BRI and disrupted many existing GPNs. It begs the research to examine if and how the pandemic-related dynamics, coupled with new circulation strategy, may allow China to reshape and even re-centralize GPNs as a whole. Second, as the BRI and its partner countries refine and consolidate the scope, impact of regional corridors, it calls for research to probe the emergence and essence of new large-scale regional economies with potentially transformed consequences for their constituent parts. This focus feeds back on and promotes a set of research questions and concerns that should be of interest to the entire RSA community. Finally, as the BRI-fueled regional corridors include and impact more cities and their surrounding hinterlands, especially small ones located on the traditional margins of the global economy, it should draw our attention to how China built special zones, new cities, and large-scale infrastructure are capable of reshaping globalization, global urbanization. C2C to 4C. This research agenda can dialogue with, benefit from, and contribute to the Plenary urbanization thesis, the growing scholarship on infrastructure and assemblage, and the emerging focus on global urban corridors and their impact on sustainable development and ecological preservation. I recently began to devote my primary effort and energy to this research effort. This is all I have to say in about 15 minutes. Unfortunately, I will not be able to be part of the Q&A discussion, but I'm looking forward to the next opportunity to do so. Thanks again for including me. Goodbye.
Oh, that was a very wonderful contribution. I think well, I've seen lots of interesting conversations and questions happening already, so keep them coming. And now we have Dr. Woon. Dr. Woon, floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Chan, for the generous introduction. And I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to RSA and Prof. Liu for organizing and inviting me to participate in this wonderful event. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of statistics to share with you all. My sort of presentation will be much more qualitative and discursive in nature. But I would perhaps like to start off my presentation by adding a caveat and also reflecting on my positionality in relation to the theme of this particular panel session. I do not really see myself as a Western scholar per se, even though I'm very much trained and exposed to British American geographical traditions and academic debates. And although I can read and write in Mandarin as I'm part of the second generation of Chinese diaspora, I do not necessarily perceive of myself as a Chinese scholar either. All right, but I would, however, like to view myself as occupying this very interesting in-between position and hopefully use this liminal space to reflect and destabilize the boundaries of and breach the gap between these two categories of scholars in whatever small ways I can. So in terms of my research interests, it lies in the field of critical geopolitics, which really looks at how geopolitics as not an objective reality, but as a discourse. Thus, my extensive publications on the BRI has really sort of focused on how this Chinese-led initiative has been framed, constructed, and also responded to discursively by both Western and Chinese officials and scholars alike. All right. And indeed, I think in the field of critical geopolitics and political geography more broadly, the gap between the Chinese and Western scholars have been duly reflected upon. So for instance, right, in a 2017 commentary piece by Yuan and colleagues, there is a sort of call for China's sort of internal geopolitical vocabularies and ideas to be translated out of mainland China so as to construct a link between scholars in China and those from the rest of the world. At the same time, there is also the suggestion that Chinese geopolitical scholarship needs to incorporate and pay attention to critical theories from the so-called Western world itself, such that it can become much more nuanced and diverse in its approach and analysis. So really taking heed of this particular call, what am I going to do in the next 7 to 8 minutes or so, right, is perhaps to mobilize a critical geopolitical framework to trace and investigate contemporary Chinese discourses about the BRI. And I think this will in turn help to raise certain pertinent and important questions about that are worthy of our consideration. So I think also this intellectual exercise is very useful given that the BRI was first formally announced in 2013, and it will actually be a good time to take stock of the changing Chinese narratives about the BRI and reflect on its wider implications and consequences. All right, so the first discourse I actually want to focus on is how the BRI has been increasingly viewed through the lens of diplomacy. All right, and I think this is very much related to how the Chinese state has conceived of the BRI as a pathway to enact the country's mantra of major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. All right, so a colleague and I have recently utilized academic theorizations on relational diplomacy to argue that such contemporary expositions of Chinese diplomacy are actually underpinned by different webs of relationality. All right. So on the one hand, right, it seems that China's postulation of its unique value of win-win cooperation imply a condition of what some scholars have called ethical relationalism. All right, with China and its diplomatic partners being bounded together in a relationship that is defined by mutuality, symmetry, harmony, and equality. All right, but I think, you know, on the other hand, China's self-professed positionality as a major country actually evokes a fundamentally hierarchical sort of worldview, where there actually exists minor and peripheral sort of states that implicitly hold less influence and weight in the wider geopolitical engagements and responsibilities. All right, and I think this relational contradiction in Chinese diplomacy have resulted in certain spatial tensions when the BRI is being operationalized at different sites and at different geographical scales. All right, and one such spatial tension I'm going to focus on in my talk, right, revolves around whether the BRI actually constitutes win-win diplomacy for a harmonious world, or whether it is really about extractive and coercive territorially based diplomacy. All right. So for instance, right, although China's policy directives pertaining to win-win cooperation may be much more feasible on the economic front, it is actually much more difficult to realize them in the security domains. All right. Given that issues such as territorial or maritime disputes tend to be zero-sum in nature. And relatedly, right, it can also be argued that President Xi Jinping has actually displayed little innovative diplomatic thinking with regard to concerns that revolve around China's sovereign and territorial integrity. All right. So indeed, right, President Xi has turned out to be much more resolute and assertive in defending perceived core interests, core national interests, due to his understanding of China's significantly enhanced geopolitical power. All right, and this has been widely referred to as the bottom line, the principal bottom line of Xi's new diplomatic approach, where China is purported to never relinquish its legitimate security and developmental rights. All right, so I think this actually induces tensions, given that China is constantly trying to negotiate between a bordered notion of state that stresses national territorial integrity, and also a civilizational state that really accentuates cultural and infrastructure connections affiliations. All right, so how would the sort of Chinese state actually resolve such a tension in order to shape broader imaginings of the benign effects of the BRI and induce sort of buy-ins to the country's new thought in diplomacy? All right, so this is a question I think we need to critically think about. All right, and I think the lens of diplomacy can also afford us another very fruitful intellectual inquiry, that is to critically examine the ever-growing number of descriptors that have been attached to the term diplomacy in order to characterize the BRI. All right, so I'm sure many of you would have heard about the BRI being discussed in terms of peripheral diplomacy, infrastructural diplomacy, tourism diplomacy, and the list actually goes on. All right, but I guess the questions here that we need to ask ourselves are, how do these different forms of diplomacy intersect and relate to one another? When operationalized on the ground, how different and unique are all these different Chinese diplomacies from existing conceptualizations of diplomacy? All right, so for instance, there have been claims that infrastructure diplomacy is essentially a variant of trade diplomacy. All right, so I think all these questions should lead us to reflect on the extent in which the BRI is indeed fostering a distinct Chinese diplomatic culture. All right, and the second discourse I want to briefly reflect on here, right, is the increasing discussion within China academic and policy scene about the digital Silk Road. All right, and I think in particular, right, there are claims that with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, all right, the progress of physical infrastructure projects under the BRI have been severely sort of delayed. Hence, the digital Silk Road, right, could potentially, according to some Chinese scholars, be BRI 2.0 to move the BRI into the next stage of development. All right, so in essence, right, the digital Silk Road sees China incorporating telecoms, media, and technology, right, to develop the BRI more effectively and sustainably across different parts of the world. All right, so China has started building submarine and terrestrial sort of optic cables and also data centers, as well as encouraging countries along the BRI to use its Beidou sort of satellite system. All right, but beyond these sort of optimistic prognosis, right, there have also been concerns that China will actually use the digital Silk Road as a way to gain intelligence and also cast surveillance to its own advantage. All right, so this has in turn resulted in countries like US, Canada, and Australia banning Chinese tech firms like Huawei, which are heavily involved in the building of China's cross-border communication networks. All right, so in this sense, right, how would existing debates on big data, cybersecurity, digital sovereignty, and also geopolitical surveillance be useful in helping us understand the broader justifications and reactions towards the digital Silk Road? All right, and I think critical perspectives are also needed to interrogate reductionist narratives by both Western and Chinese sort of scholars and policymakers that a new Cold War, all right, is currently underway with the advancement of the digital Silk Road. All right, so for one, right, this simplistic sort of shorthand of a new Cold War seeks to deterministically suggest that only one particular antagonistic geopolitical outcome of this initiative is present, whilst downplaying other diplomatic and cooperative trajectories and pathways that the digital Silk Road can actually progress on. All right, so I will conclude here. So in sum, right, based on my discussions thus far, I would like to propose 3 different ways to take BRI research forward. All right, so first of all, right, I think it's important for much more collaborative research on the BRI to be carried out by both Western and Chinese scholars. All right, so critical Western theories can be put into productive conversations with Chinese scholarly works, philosophies, and traditions in order to produce more robust understandings of the BRI. All right. Second, even though I focus on the discourses of the BRI today, it is necessary to engage in grounded and multi-sided research on the BRI in order to critically appreciate how discourses about major country diplomacy, as well as the digital Silk Road, for instance, are being played out, negotiated, and responded to by different actors on the ground. All right, and I think this would actually allow for much more nuanced understandings of the BRI without reducing it simply to the threatening versus benign dualistic sort of frame of analysis. All right. And finally, there should be much more temporally sensitive research on the BRI. As I've shown in my sort of presentation today, right, discourses of the BRI actually shift and morph over time. All right. It is also erroneous to assume that the CCP government is a static and unchanging actor. All right. Thus, it is also very important to reflect on how the Chinese state has also carefully responded to various criticisms of the BRI on the ground and fine-tune the sort of initiative accordingly. All right. So indeed, right, in the recent book, Cheng actually contends that Chinese foreign policy concepts should be understood as political slogans rather than coherent, well thought out strategic plans. And in this particular formulation, foreign policy ideas advanced by the CCP government are often declarations of intent, and they remain vague, undefined, and are subjected to changes. And according to Yeung, right, scholars play a major role in filling these ideas with meanings in a subsequent and incremental nature. All right. As such, right, we as scholars, be it Western or Chinese or neither, have the responsibility to produce nuanced and accurate research that will hopefully allow the BRI to develop in the right direction and fulfill its promises and potentials for different communities on the ground. All right. So that's my sort of presentation for today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Yuan. I think you raised some very interesting points about temporality, and also the combination of discursive and grounded scholarship is something that all three speakers we have today have conducted in recent years. And coming to the Q&A box, I think actually there is something that could link a number of questions up quite nicely. There was an earlier question about any studies of BRI on Latin America. And Lottie Thompson also raised a question: could the analysis of BRI literature be extended to compare with research done by scholars who are based in host countries such as Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa? We also have a first part of a question from Sally Hardy on whether or not there are empirical areas of BRI that are not receiving sufficient attention. I think in a way there are two tiers within these questions, and the first bit is kind of straightforward, kind of which areas, empirical, geographical areas you think are not receiving enough attention, and what are the ways that collaborative fieldwork or special issues or webinars like the one we have today could bring scholars from host countries more in dialogue with Chinese or as Yuan said, Western inspired Chinese scholars in a way. Xiao, would you like to have a go?
Okay. Yeah, so about Latin America, I think each of us, Chen, Han, and Chih and me, we give a name. And you can find it in the chat box, right? So I don't want to repeat. I mean, you can just paste. And about host country researchers, right? So like I have a Brazilian colleague, and this year she published a paper about barrier initiative related Chinese investment in her country, but in Portuguese. I think that's partly some of the literature. Not really invisible, but hard for us to get access to or to understand. And also from my personal experience about Ghana, I know some Ghanaian scholars, geographers mainly, and they actually publish very good articles about Chinese investment in their country. But the focus is a bit different in my view, more about like local livelihoods or say the result of consequent the Chinese investment in their own country. But like for me, I focus more about interactions between Chinese actors and ways host country and other international players. That's an example. But I think China knows better about Southeast Asian country cases. And I think Sally's question is Do I believe there's enough? Well, I think that goes back to my first concern about how shall we define Belt Road Initiative. I mean, whether enough attention paid to the Belt Road Initiative in terms of what? So like in terms of strategic relations between China and other countries, or like international organizations, or say negotiation, planning, or say implementation of specific projects in certain countries. Definitely not every country with Chinese investment or under the Belt Road Initiative umbrella receive enough attention, I think. Latin American countries, they are examples sometimes, right? And also, as Yuan mentioned, so the Chinese policy making, sometimes this discourse is more about like evolving political slogans, not really coherent, well-designed policies. So Belt Road Initiative itself, for me, it's like changing. It's counter even just to say how the Chinese government defines it. So I don't think there is a point of being enough attention paid to Belt Road Initiative. So, but luckily, I believe there are more attention paid to the Belt Road Initiative than I know or we know. There are certain issues received attention, but maybe not being published in the form of academic work. So that's basically my answer.
Thank you. Yuan?
Yeah, can I perhaps add on to Sally's question about, what are some areas receiving insufficient attention, and what regions are receiving insufficient attention. So when we are talking about under-researched sort of areas or regions, right, I think we should sort of be careful about saying that, they are under-researched, because I think in the sort of native language themselves, they are actually works on BRI that are being published, but they're not known to the sort of English-speaking world. So there's a sort of geopolitics of knowledge production here that we need to be mindful of, that in the sort of journals, the things that we read, right, tends to be sort of published in English, and we tend to read more of those sort of articles and sort of works itself. But definitely, I think in Southeast Asia, for instance, there are many sort of good scholars in Malaysia and sort of Indonesia that are publishing in their sort of own sort of native languages about the BRI, but we seldom hear about all these things because they are not published in English. So I think this is where I think the collaborative research can come into play here, and we need more translations sort of acts to actually let these sort of very good articles to be known by the sort of international scholarly community. But I think besides the sort of different regions as well, I think within regions there are also disparity in terms of the coverage of BRI itself. So let's say, for instance, within Southeast Asian sort of context, I see a lot of articles coming out in terms of the sort of BRI in Laos and Cambodia, but not so much in the Singapore sort of context. All right, for some reason, I don't know why Singapore sort of context seems to be sort of underrepresented in BRI sort of research. So I've been starting a new project on understanding grounded interpretations of the BRI in the Singapore context. I've been trying to look up literatures around this particular area, but there are really quite little sort of issues or sort of articles writing on this particular sort of area. So I think even within regions themselves, there are sort of disparity in coverage of the BRI. Yeah.
Great. I think perhaps what was in that, I really enjoyed the point about knowledge production. Obviously, there are different views and theoretical backgrounds, well, even institutional backgrounds involved in the geographically situated processes of knowledge production. But I suppose, in part, one of the contributions that BRI has made over the past years is the creation of a sort of scholarly connectivity, hopefully towards a more polycentric geography of knowledge production. I'm afraid we have come to the end of this panel, and thank you, Xiao and Yuan and Professor Chen, who can't join us, very much for your insightful remarks. I think one key takeaway from our panel today, amongst other things, is the importance of exchange and dialogue between Chinese and Western scholars, however you define that, in narrowing the gap of understanding, especially based on more and more detailed empirical case studies. So appreciation from me to all three speakers for being such a wonderful panel and the stimulating discussion. And thank you to the wonderful audience. I hope you enjoyed it and will stay on for our last panel. I'm gonna hand it over to Daniela, and thank you and bye for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cheng, and all the speakers in this fascinating session for the great insights. We have now again 5 minutes time for a quick refreshment break, and the last session will focus on tips and tricks on how to publish in international journals. I hope to see you then again. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of this great set of RSA webinars today. So this third session is, as you all know, on publishing in international journals. So we're delighted to welcome Professor Mick Dunford, who will introduce in just a second. Just for some house rules, which probably you're familiar with if you've been tuning in earlier in the day. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available for RSA members in the RSA Members Lounge. If you have any questions, please do use the question and answer function, and you can also upvote questions you like by giving them a thumbs up. The chat function is also there for you to use in the meantime. And now I'll just go ahead and introduce this session. The aim of this session is really to outline the main issues that are involved in writing and publishing an academic article. So we will discuss how to choose a journal, how to prepare a manuscript and submit, how articles are referred for peer review, and how to handle referee reports. We'll also talk about paying attention to language and presentational issues that might come up when you're seeking, particularly how to publish in a language that might not be your mother tongue. And we'll spend a lot of this session also just having a back and forth with Professor Dunford being able to answer any questions that come up that participants might pose. So please do engage and interact as much as you would like. So now I'm delighted to introduce Professor Michael Dunford from the Chinese Academy of Sciences in China and the University of Sussex in the UK. Professor Dunford is a CAS Senior International Scientist at the Institute of Geographical Sciences and Natural Resources Research, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Emeritus Professor at the University of Sussex. He's an expert in economic geography and urban and regional analysis, and his research deals primarily with growth, inequality, and social cohesion, economic reconstruction and industrial development, regional differentiation and urbanization in China, and a wide range of other topics, which are all very much germane to the mission of the RSA. Since 2006, he's participated in a number of projects in China, including an EU-China regional policy dialogue and a number of different projects with the Chinese State Council leading group on poverty alleviation and development. He's published his work in over 200 journal articles and book chapters, many of which you're probably already familiar with. And he's been in recent years, elected to the Academy of Social Sciences, an honorary member of the Società Geographica Italiana. So to be able to spend more time on the discussion, I won't go through his further illustrious awards, but he is very renowned in the field, and we are delighted to welcome him here. So Professor Dunford, the floor is yours.
So I said I'm not sure where you all are. So I guess I should say welcome to Beijing. At present, of course, in Beijing, we're in the Northern Hemisphere, so it's the autumn. And today I actually had to go to collect my passport. So on the journey, I took a number of photographs. So most of these photographs were taken today. Today, and most of the recent days have been absolutely beautiful. You know, with blue skies, and the autumn is one of the nicest seasons in this city. And some of these photos, in a sense, capture some of the extraordinary ways in which it's been changing in the last few years. So if you haven't been here for the last 4 or 5 years, I do hope once this pandemic is resolved, many of you will be able to come back and see some of the extraordinary ways in which the city has changed. So I'm going to talk about very briefly a journal called Area Development and Policy, which was established as from 2016. It's a journal that I edit with Wai-chung. We have an editorial assistant, an editorial office in Beijing where Bai Lu works. And then there are associate editors in there are 9 associate editors, and they're in basically the global south and global east. So Africa, East Asia, India, Latin America, Russia, the United States. And then obviously, you know, we work with an editorial advisory board and with a series of peer reviewers. as with other journals, we publish a range of types of articles. So basically, most of the articles we publish are what we would call research articles. Generally speaking, they're articles of about 9,000 words, although we, in some cases, will move beyond that limit if we think the substance of the article actually warrants it. We also publish research notes, and in this case, there's less of a commitment, to engage with theory and with the existing literature, and it's more a matter, to some extent, of reporting the results of research that people have done. We publish review articles, which are essentially reviews of literature on a range of issues, and we also publish commentaries, and some of these commentaries are in fact extremely interesting. Some of them are reflections on lectures that we organize annually, most of which have been organized at the AAG annual conference, but we've also organized some at Regional Studies Association conferences, including one a few years ago in China. So there's a variety of types of contributions that we accept. The illustration is simply a cartoon that was actually produced from one of the articles that was published in the very first issue. It's an article basically about the city of Chongqing in southwest China. And there's a message there in a sense that when you write an article, you want to write something, I'll come back to it, that has a large impact, and impact sometimes comes through having really quite a simple message, that can be summarized in a significant way that at the same time breaks new ground. As far as this journal is concerned, I said it was a new journal. It started in 2016. It was then included in the Web of Science Emerging Sources Citation Index, and it was also included in Scopus in 2018. It's not yet an SSCI journal, but we hope that it will be indexed by SSCI in the relatively near future. The publisher is Taylor and Francis, and it's produced basically with the Regional Studies Association and in association with the Chinese Academy of Sciences. But the publisher produced an impact factor for 2018, which was actually quite good. I mean, 3.179, and it ranked us in geography, although the journal is also ranked in other sets. And at that point, it was ranked 13th, which also is exceptionally high for a new journal. A few days ago, I actually looked up Scopus, and then I looked up Web of Science. So if you look at Scopus, there have been about 582 citations, right, for a journal which started in, as I said, 2016. And the chart on the right shows how those citations have actually increased over the course of time. So in the first year, 2016, there were relatively few. But since then, it's risen very rapidly. In 2020, those figures are up to early September. So we're only really 3/4 of the way through the year. Hopefully, those numbers will be significantly higher than they were in 2019. So citation is something that's very important, and I'm going to come back to that when I talk about getting published in journals. So ADP really publishes research about the Global South and Global East. And it's about, in a sense, starting to operate in what one might call a plural world. So we pay a lot of, we basically have an agenda, as does every journal. When you submit to a journal, it's absolutely vitally important that you really think about what the agenda of the journal is. So, we say that ADP recognizes that research should examine the role of national and regional institutional configurations and values. And it should, to some extent, in many cases, research should derive to some extent from theories that relate to the experiences of different parts of the world. So one can see the world through lenses, from different parts of it. And mutual understanding in our world depends to an increasing extent on people understanding people who live and work in different parts of the world and sometimes see it in different ways. So, a plural world, we also thought can't simply be understood in terms of models and theories that derive from the really exceptional experiences of Northwest Europe and North America. So, the aim in a sense is to start to see theorization and innovation, emerging in many parts of the world. So we publish research that reflects a range of perspectives that emerge from the global south and from the global east, and research by people who see the world through a variety of lenses that sometimes are not strongly represented in mainstream Western journals. We want to contribute to international communication, and we don't want to judge the experiences of one part of the world in terms of simply in terms of Western values. We've just had a session on the BRI, and I think, if you want to understand the BRI, you actually have to understand Confucian value systems, a kind of Confucian view of international relations. So you have to be able to put yourself in the feet, of people who are putting forward these ideas. And I think that if one moves in that kind of direction, we'll start to move towards a world in which we can live together and work together, rather than one that is characterized by conflict that is all too serious and all too problematic in the world in which we live. So ADP has a particular agenda. Every other journal has a particular agenda. If you want to publish in these journals, it's absolutely vital that you try to look at what the key agenda of the journal is and make sure that the work that you're seeking to publish to some extent relates to that agenda. Beyond that, we say that there are three important things that matter. One is originality, second is significance, and the third is rigor. So we want high scholarly standards. Articles should be original contributions, providing new knowledge. The knowledge that they put forward should, in a sense, be significant and likely to have a significant impact on other researchers. And it should be rigorous in the sense that it's well grounded empirically, that it engages with evidence, that it uses appropriate methods of analysis, that it deals with the representativeness of cases. In the world today, one often reads stories about particular individuals or particular places, and suddenly, these individual cases are used as representative of a much wider situation. Now, it's very dangerous in moving from individual cases to making wider generalizations. So it's vital, in all research, that basically much more attention is paid to the extent to which one can generalize from the specific thing that one has studied. So all of these are issues, that play an important role in our assessment of articles. We want articles to have an impact. I'll come back to impact in a minute. And also, if you look at ADP, I think, so far the standard of written English is very high, but in that area, because we're publishing work by people whose first language is often not English, we actually give them, once we've decided to publish the article, a very significant amount of help with getting their work into a form in which it's written in a high quality colloquial English, that to some extent corresponds with the norms and conventions of the particular disciplines in which that work is situated. And we publish work, that comes out of area studies, out of international relations, out of economics, out of geography, out of urban planning, out of regional development studies. So I've said something mainly about the journal, and then I've talked a little about the kind of criteria that all journals apply when they are looking at whether or not to publish research. And I want to say something now about publishing in journals, more general about publishing in journals. This is a very simple diagram. In a sense, it summarizes what the peer review process is all about. You start with a world in which scientists study some phenomenon. Social scientists, natural scientists, environmental scientists. And then, having studied something, you write up the results of your investigation. You write essentially what you've discovered, what you think is new, what you think is going to reshape the way in which people think about and look at the world. And then you send that article to a journal, to an editor. So those editors then have to choose referees. And normally they'll choose, well, people's policies differ, they'll choose 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 people, because quite often referees say, I'm too busy, I'm afraid I don't have time to do it. Most journals need at least 2 reports. So they write to these referees, they get reports from them, and then these referees provide feedback to the editor. The editors will then look at that feedback, and then they will decide whether they think the work has potential, possibly, you know, after revision, almost invariably, in fact, after revision. If they think it has potential, then they will actually ask the scientists or the authors to look at these reports and to revise their article in the light of them, and then to resubmit. And that is a cycle that one can go through several times. And at the end of that process, you know, some articles are finally accepted. In the case of ADP at the moment, we have quite a high acceptance rate. You know, it's close to about 40%. It's about 36, 37% at present, which is relatively high. But many of the articles go through several cycles of revision, you know, to get them up to a standard where they're capable of being published in the journal. How long does it take? Well, in the case of ADP, I would say it's relatively fast. I mean, the average turnaround is about 60 days. You can see here there's a distribution. So actually about 40% get turned around within 30 days. I'll explain that number in a minute. Another, you know, 38% get turned around within 60 days. So that's 2 months. And then there are some that are turned around within 3 months. Some take longer than that. If it takes longer than that, sometimes it is for good reasons. I mean, sometimes, for example, you write to some referees and you get 2 reports back and they completely disagree with one another. So if they completely disagree, what do you do? Well, basically, you've got to go to new referees. So you then have to appoint new referees to get additional reports to enable you to come to some judgment about that particular article. So there are things that can extend the review process. And sometimes, of course, I mean, it's the case that editors take longer than they should. And in a sense, in this particular year, that is a particular problem because with COVID having a huge impact on people's work, you know, people find it more difficult, you know, because it's a task that people do essentially as volunteers. You can see that we turn around a lot within 30 days. That's in part because we have, in fact, turned our articles sent out for referees very quickly indeed. And there are ways in which, you know, we as editors can actually do that. But it's also the case now that as other journals, we are starting to introduce more desk rejects. In other words, you know, when the article comes in, it goes to an editor who basically reads it first and decides whether to go to referees. At first, we tried to give feedback, you know, to everyone by going to referees. But I mean, I think in the last 2 years, we've actually increased the number of desk rejects. And if we do that, we normally make sure that an editor writes a report that then goes to the author explaining why we chose not to send that particular article out to referees. What is involved in preparing an article? Well, I mean, these are very simple pieces of advice. I mean, you've got to know your reasons, you know, for wanting to publish that article. And those reasons have got to be persuasive. And you've got to connect up with a particular research field, and you've got to connect with the agenda of a journal. You must answer a question that's interesting and significant. You know, a simple sort of descriptive exercise is not going to have much impact. So you've got to ask interesting and important questions. In the last session, people were asking interesting questions about, you know, why is it that scholars in China and outside China look at the BRI in very different ways? These are issues. If you can come up with an answer to that question, I mean, I think that would be something that would actually be very significant. And if you could explain what explains the stances that are adopted by people in different parts of the world, that again is an interesting and significant issue. So you must do work, you know, that addresses questions that are important, that have you know, potential practical, policy, and other types of theoretical importance. And at the same time, you often want to contribute to a discussion that's going on. If you contribute to a discussion that's going on, it's quite likely that your work will have a significant impact because other people taking part in that discussion will read what you've said, and then they will want to respond to what you've said. And if you do that, editors will think, well, if we publish that article is quite likely to be cited by other researchers, and is quite likely to generate a great deal of interest. So, the first issue. Second, you've got to have basically a good story to tell. I mean, often we say concentrate on a single central take-home message that you want people to go away with when they've read your article. You know, something that you should be able to say to someone in a few sentences or in an abstract of about 100 words precisely what it is you are trying to say. And in your abstract, you shouldn't go through again and say, what data you used, you know, what methods you used. What you should tell the reader is what you found out and why it is important and why other people, you know, in that way, other people will pay attention to it. If you work with other people, it's very important from the outset that you discuss who does what, whose role is what, and what your different contributions are going to be. Okay. And fourthly, you must choose a journal carefully. Earlier, I said something about the agenda of area development and policy. It's vital that you look at the agenda of the journal, that you see to what extent your article fits with that agenda, that you look at who reads that journal. You know, if you're a quantitative economist, you don't want to be trying to publish your work in a journal that doesn't publish work of that kind, because quantitative economists will not look at that journal. You may want to look at the impact factor of the journal, although what matters is not the impact factor of a journal, but actually the impact factor of your work. You may want to look at whether it's open access. Now, if it's open access, it's quite conceivable that there'll be a publication fee, which might be quite large. But obviously, there are advantages, because then you can make your article is freely available on the internet to everyone, and you can disseminate it without any restriction. You should obviously read recent papers in the journal, and you should look at the guide to authors, spelling out, you know, how you should submit your article. If you don't do that, it's quite likely that it will simply be a desk reject. And you may want to relate, you know, to recent articles published in that particular journal. Okay, so those are important pieces of advice. You know, beyond that, I say write clearly and try to create a good impression by following the journal's rules. And maybe, you know, things like proofreading are important, but we recognize that many of our authors are not native English speakers. And in fact, you know, when we write to referees at the moment, we tell them that we want you to look at whether this article has scientific potential. Because basically, you know, sometimes the language problems can be dealt with later. The only difficulty is that sometimes language problems get in the way of understanding. So you've got to be able to communicate effectively, even if the language is not perfect. This I probably don't need to tell you, all right? We can come back to this if you want to. It just summarizes the structure of an article, which is basically fairly standard. Suppose you get asked to revise. Sometimes your article is rejected, but rejection doesn't always mean rejection. So we basically have a category called reject and resubmit. Now that means that that particular article is rejected, but the referees and all the editors saw some potential in it. So you, in a sense, have an invitation to have another go, but to fundamentally revise the article and then to seek to resubmit it. In other cases, you're simply asked to undertake revision, which may sometimes be very major. But doesn't, if you're asked to revise, there's no necessary commitment to publish that article. So the first thing you must do is take reviews extremely seriously. You need to think about what you need to do to satisfy the referees and the authors. And when you revise your article, you should read the comments from the referee point by point. And then you have to write a point by point response. We ask people to take the decision letter with the referee reports at the end, and then to edit that decision letter explaining how they've dealt with each and every point raised by the referees. You should obviously make changes to the manuscript. It's not enough just to say, I don't agree. And it's not enough to say why you don't agree. It's fair enough to say that you disagree and to explain clearly why you do, but I think there has to be some evidence, that the document, that the manuscript has been revised, at the very least, in order to clarify and strengthen the arguments that were questioned by the referees. And I think the last piece of advice on this score is that basically don't give up. If you think what you've done is significant and it is rejected, you should use the criticisms. We actually reject quite a lot of papers. I've told you that we now have more desk rejects. We reject them because they don't fit the agenda of the journal. They're basically out of scope. So quite a few articles fall in that category. So in that case, it's not so much the substance of the article that's being rejected, it's basically its correspondence with the agenda of the journal. So you therefore have to think very carefully about where you submitted it and to see whether there's some other places that are more appropriate for the publication of that research. What will determine whether it's published? Well, it comes back to things that I said at the beginning. The first is, how important, how much interest will that article generate? What's the main message? Does it generate a question that is interesting and important? Does it tell a good story? Will other people want to read it? And will other people cite it? People put a lot of energy into writing articles in journals. It's not just a matter of seeing your name in print. What you want to do is to try and shape, the agenda of your discipline, of your field of studies. And you do that by having an impact upon the work of other people and then interacting, with other researchers. I said originality and significance. So what you write should be a new contribution to knowledge, something that improves understanding, provides a new theoretical contribution, new empirical evidence, a new methodology, something that has important policy implications. So originality and significance are vital determinants of whether or not your work will be published. Obviously, it has to stand up scientifically. So what is the strength of the evidence? Is the data valid? Is the methodology used justifiable? So the scientific quality of the work plays a fundamental role in determining whether or not it will be published. Fourth, I've said several times, does it fit the agenda of the journal? Is it connected with work that's been published in the journal in the past? Okay, so these are important issues. And again, as I said earlier, write clearly, obey submission rules, read proofs carefully. This is just one article that was published recently in ADP. This is the first issue of this year. It was an article Deborah brought it on. It's called A Critical Look at Chinese Net Diplomacy, The Rise of a Meme. This article has had, I think, in excess of 10,000 people look it up. That's extraordinary. That is very, very high. So people look at views of articles to see how many people are looking at articles. This article is also already, within what, about 7 or 8 months, actually had quite a significant number of sites. So you should be seeking to publish work, that itself has a significant impact in the sense that if you have an interesting title and an interesting abstract, people will find it. And then people will look it up and then they'll look at the abstract and maybe they'll read it. And if they found it interesting, maybe they will cite it. And editors are looking for articles that do have impacts of this kind. You should also look at the journal website. I mean, in the case of our journal, there's been a very, very large increase in usage of the site. On the left in yellow there are some of the figures for the number of people who have looked at the journal and looked up articles that are published in the journal on the journal website. So 2019, the total was 24,000. This year it's 17,000, but it's way up from the similar figure at the same point in time last year, which was 12,000. So when you look at these sites, you'll often see up here, there's something called new content alerts. If there's a journal, you know, in which the work that you do is frequently published, you should actually click on that new content alert so that you're told about what appears in the journal. In that sense, you'll see what the journal's agenda is, how it's evolving, what is being published, what the relationship of other work is to the work that you yourself is doing. You might do that for a whole number of journals. So, you know, this information is extremely useful and extremely important. So you should try to follow, you know, very closely what is happening in your field. And then in that sense, you know, you can adjust your work and address some of the issues that emerge in these other pieces of work. So you should look at alerts, you should follow what is happening in the journals in which you are interested, the journals that publish the type of research that you yourself are doing. Okay, I mean, that's basically all I wanted to say as an introduction. We can see perhaps if there are any questions, see also maybe whether Mia, you know, wants to say something, because, you know, she's now had quite considerable experience, you know, in relation to editing ADP, but also she's herself, you know, publishing a lot of her own work in a range of different journals. Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Mick. That was a terrific presentation. I think a lot of excellent advice, and there was a question. So yes, this will be available for future viewing again and reference. And as Professor Dunford mentioned, yes, I actually forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. So I am an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, and I do serve on the editorial board of ADP. And I've done that for a couple of years now, and I've been extremely grateful for this opportunity because it has allowed me, as an early career scholar, having received my PhD in 2017, a lot of insight into how this kind of the black box of publishing works. So my interactions with the journal began first as I published a short research note. So that's also a great way for kind of early career scholars who maybe don't have a full academic article yet to contribute, but if they feel they have something still worthwhile to say that doesn't, as Professor Dunford said, engage quite so rigorously with theory, it's still a really great opportunity to publish. So I did that early on, and then that often turns into opportunities once you published in a journal to review for it. And that built on itself, and then I began editing. So I will receive now and then articles across my inbox that I'll read and then send out for review. So it's been really insightful, and from this I've now built up some editorial experience, which I think is also very key for early career scholars to do. And I now serve on the editorial board of one other journal, which is Dialogues in Human Geography. So I find editing just a really fantastic experience to kind of also, I think in ADP, have this role of trying to really encourage, as Professor Dunford has said, authors from beyond the global north, right? We really are keen to see representation of a wide range of perspectives of scholars from countries beyond just the Anglophone sphere. And we are very much willing to work on English and language with you if that is one particular challenge. So are there anyone want to jump in with a question? I don't have any open at the moment, but if you want to brainstorm some of those, that'd be great. Perhaps in the meantime, while attendees are thinking of questions, Professor Dunford, one question I might have for you is actually, you mentioned what authors can expect during the peer review process, but one question I often see coming from my own PhD students, from other early career scholars, is if they're asked to do a peer review, how much time should they spend on it? Do you have any tips for doing peer review for the first time?
Well, I think, I mean, the first thing one can say is that you probably have submitted your own, if you're asked to review, you've got some experience in the sense that you've submitted your own research and you've actually seen some peer reviews. Peer reviews vary enormously in quality. Enormously in quality. You know, some are very short and not very helpful. Some are actually quite detailed and extraordinarily helpful. And to some extent, that depends upon the peer reviewer. It depends in part on how much interest they have in the article that is sent to them. Probably also depends on how much time they have at their disposition. I think if you're a young researcher, I think it's a task that is quite likely to involve, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 days, right? If you're an experienced researcher, it's probably something that you can do relatively quickly. When I was an undergraduate, if I read an article, it would take me a long time, a long time, because many of the concepts, many of the ideas were things that one was learning about for the very first time. After 20 or 30 years, you've got a lot of kind of accumulated knowledge, and so you can read very, very quickly. And you can, to some extent, have a much greater range of experience of published literature. So you can draw on a wider range of material in order to try to provide some feedback. But so I think, 3 or 4 days probably, if you do something seriously, if you're very early on in your career, but if later on, when you get to sort of 40 or 50, so you can normally write reviews much more quickly and read articles much more quickly. What else? Does that help, or what would you say? You yourself wrote review articles, so how long do you think it takes you to do it?
I would agree that early on it did take me longer. I don't know if I ever quite spent 3 or 4 days, but definitely at least a full day or 2 reading the article, digesting it, stepping away from it for a moment, and then coming back to it. So I'll certainly always read an article 2 or 3 times. And then I try and, in the first pass, get a sense of kind of what the author is trying to convey. And the second and third reading, I'll go in a little bit more narrowly to maybe point out specific areas of concern I might have. And then in writing the review, that often is a whole process in and of itself that I think, I always try, no matter the quality of the article, always try and say some supportive words at the beginning, because the authors have put a lot of time and effort into that, and you want to recognize that. So you kind of recognize the strengths of it, and then you can, after that, I think, point out some areas for improvement. And I often kind of have the little bit of an overview, a few paragraphs, and then more line by line comments. And I think you mentioned a really important point in talking about how critical the response to referees is, and that it's not enough to even just revise the article, but reviewers, referees will be looking to read carefully the response you write and craft. And if you can provide a point-by-point response to every concern they've raised, whether you're saying you disagree or agree, but just somehow acknowledging all of the concerns they've raised, I think that will go a long way to showing that you did the work in reviewing the article, in responding to the article. Let's see, there's maybe one question coming up here. I think it'll appear in the Q&A box in a second, but do you, how does the editorial team or board, how can they offer clues of how much your work might fit? Is there anything we can kind of suggest as editors?
Okay, well, I just respond to the comment about refereeing. With these days, sometimes when I have to make a decision on an article, sometimes you have to read other work. I said, why might it take a while? Sometimes you actually need to read something that you haven't read. So you don't just read that article. Sometimes you need to check certain things, because often if you do a good review of an article, sometimes you want to check the veracity of claims that are made, and to check the veracity of some claims, you sometimes need to look at other sources. So, but you would do that. You would do that if that article relates very closely, to your own research, because actually, in that sense, refereeing articles is something that can actually contribute to your own thinking and help you improve the quality of what you're doing yourself. So, in that sense, it's actually often a very, very useful thing to do. Your question again.
Oh yes, whether the editorial board can offer any clues about whether a potential author's work might fit. For instance, if you receive a query from a a scholar, oh, here's my abstract, do you think would fit? How much can you really say to them?
Well, I could probably say, if someone wrote to me and said, I want to write an article on this, I think it would be very easy to say to them whether I thought it fitted the agenda of the journal. But I mean, you can yourself find out, because I said just now, for example, you should sign up so that you get information about what is being published in the journal. You should look at past issues of the journal just to see what it was published. You should read the abstracts of articles published in the journal. It takes a few minutes to read an abstract. You should read some of the abstracts, because from that you will get some sense of the agenda of that journal. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that every single journal has a mission statement. So on their website they will usually have material which explains what that journal is seeking to publish, what questions that journal is seeking to address, what types of material it will publish. And with a new journal, so in the case of ADP, the authors at the outset, normally in the first issue, will actually set out some kind of mission statement. So you can read that, and from that you can get a very, very good sense of what sort of work that journal is trying to publish, work all about. Okay, so collect information, about what's being published. Right? Read articles in the journal and see what they are dealing with, and then if there is a mission statement, read that mission statement.
Great, thank you for that. And I think I would just also add in here, if your own article is not naturally citing work in that journal, there might also not be a evident fit.
Actually, that's a very, very good point. That's a very, very good point. You should look at your references, and then look at the references of articles in that journal. And you should see whether work is being referred to is the same, or if it is not. See if the journals that are being referred to are the same or are not. Because if you're not referring to the same journals and you're not referring to articles by the same authors, then really your work may not fit in that journal. But then you have to look across a wide range of articles, okay? You can't just look at one or two. You have to look across a range, because often every journal will cover a range of material.
Fantastic. All right, we have another question here, which is whether you have any advice on publishing open access, pros and cons of it, and also whether ADP offers a possibility of publishing open access.
Okay. If Sally's there, she can talk about open access. ADP can publish articles open access. We've published one, open access. I mean, it's simply a question as to whether, in the first instance, the author or authors can afford the open access fee. So if you can afford, if you have a research grant, and if you think it's a good quality article, one of your better quality articles, then you basically should try to publish it open access, because if you publish open access, far more people are going to see it. And you have much more freedom over what you can do with it. You can send it to as many people as you want. You can post it on as many websites as you want. So, it will be seen by far more people if you publish in that way. But it's often not inexpensive. In some journals you might pay $5,000 for an open access article. If you have a research grant, or if your institution provides research funding for articles that are open access, then it may well be affordable. So if it's affordable, go down that route. If it's not, then you have to choose the other path, where there'll be some restrictions, or copyright restrictions on what you can do with the article, what you can post. But even if you go down, a path where you don't have open access, it's important to read the agreement, with the publisher when you publish the article, because you can often post versions of the article, that you produced in the process of writing the article and submitting it. In many cases, the penultimate version, the version that is accepted but as a TypeScript, can actually be posted on websites. And I would say that's also something that's very, very important. I mean, if you do that, your work will start to be seen, will start to be cited.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see, we don't have any open questions, so I can jump in with another one maybe, which is, so in terms of the articles that have gotten the most attention in ADP, you showed the one by Professor Brautigam, but I'm wondering, Brautigam, yeah. So I'm wondering, beyond that, what have you noticed in terms of any similarities of the articles that attract the most attention? Is it that they're speaking to very timely themes, or is there some kind of social media element with that to get promoted, or what can you say to that?
I think in terms of, well, the first thing one can say is that some authors get cited more than others. So, I mean, if you publish articles by certain authors who are very, very well known, then it's quite likely that that work will usually be quite widely cited. And in a sense, you know, in the case of ADP, we organize lectures, and often for these lectures we invite, you know, well-known established scholars, and then we always publish those lectures with several commentaries. And we found that those lectures are actually often, when published as an article, cited quite widely. So that's one thing. Issues. I mean, in the case of ADP, we've published quite a few articles on the BRI, written by scholars from China or affiliated with Chinese institutions, but we've also published articles by people from Russia, from the Eurasian Economic Union. We've published articles from people in other emerging countries, and generally speaking, those articles have all been quite widely cited. Sometimes, you know, there are things written by people who are not at all well known. There was one which is just simply by a research student, right, with a supervisor, but it's on the Pakistan Economic Corridor, and it seems as though, I mean, that clearly is a subject that is of very, very considerable interest. So that article actually has quite a substantial number of cites. So certain issues, you know, that are very topical, and issues in relation to which one says something that maybe is slightly new or innovative, are things that will, you know, have a very large impact. I think, you know, so that, I said, you know, when you do study, when you do some research, try to choose an issue that is significant and important. If you do that, I think it's quite likely that the work will be cited. If you chose something extremely obscure on which no one else is working, maybe it won't have much impact.
Great, I think that's some really useful advice. Yeah. Sorry, were you going to add something?
Well, I was going to say, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I would agree that.
You know, Mia's written a piece which is also quite well cited, you know, which was, it was a commentary, wasn't it? I think initially on the BRI, but that actually it was basically looking at it from kind of Russian side, but that is quite widely cited. So why?
Yeah, why? I think being able to say something early on as a maybe new development in politics and economics at a global scale is emerging. If you can recognize that and say something rather quickly that has a point, I think you have a better chance of being cited. At the same time, I would probably add a note of caution, which is probably an issue we're all familiar with too much now, which is there's so much research coming out about COVID-19, for instance, right, which is a obviously very timely issue, and yet there's a lot of errors in the research because it's been done too quickly. So I think there's a balance to be struck between trying to be at the vanguard of new research, but yet also maintaining a level of rigor that is expected of you just as a scholar in general, and particularly for journals such as ADP. So navigating that is a balancing act, I think. Let's see. Do we have any other questions from participants? We have a few minutes left. If there aren't any from the floor, I can maybe jump in with one last question or so, which would be in terms of, you mentioned the help that ADP editors can provide to scholars for whom English isn't their first language. In what kind of shape do you think these articles should be in the first round of submission? How important is it that English is really fluent?
I think at the first stage, ideally, you know, if you're not a native English speaker, then and you've not spent a number of years living and studying in an English language speaking country, then ideally, before you submit anything, you should actually find a native English speaker and ask them to read it. You don't need to ask them to edit it significantly for you. You just need to get them to give you some advice about whether what you're saying is clear. I'm saying in relation to ADP, right? Is what I am trying to say clearly expressed? You know, will the person who reads it understand what I'm trying to say? Because if what you write is not really that is sufficiently intelligible, then you know it's quite likely that your article might not even be sent to referees. So it's got to be of a standard such that it's understandable and such that people know what you're trying to say. I mean, when I went to school, you know, I learned French and German, and you know, I remember in those days, one used to say that when you speak English, you know, I say what I mean, but if I use French, then I say what I can, which is not at all the same thing. So, you know, many people, you know, they're operating in that kind of world. They're operating in another language. So what they do is they say what they can. They don't necessarily say what they mean. You've got to try to ensure that what you say is close enough to what you mean, that people will see the quality or the potential quality. That's the first thing. I mean, with ADP, beyond that, we do say in the letter to referees, we say, does it have potential? And we don't want you to be exceptionally negative simply because of the quality, you know, the quality of the English. A lot of referees do comment on language quality, and it's quite amusing, you know, because many of the people who make critical comments about language quality are not themselves native speakers. You know, sometimes, you know, they themselves are, you know, not strictly correct, you know. So, but that's important. But some journals do pay a lot of attention to language quality, and obviously that makes it very difficult. You know, the reason why English is important, of course, is because it's an international language. You know, basically most people in the world learn English, and so it's important as a language of international communication. It's important in a world in which, you know, people want to understand one another. It may change. You know, Chinese will become more important. Spanish is obviously also extremely important. But at present, English is an important language in international communication. With ADP, you know, in the end, you know, if we decide to publish, then an editor reads it very, very carefully. And actually, you know, a lot of our final accepted manuscripts are extremely heavily edited, really heavily edited, you know, whole sentences rewritten. Sometimes every single sentence edited, you know, to try to get it into good English. So you know, if we publish, you know, we at the moment give a huge amount of help. Beyond that, there are, you know, publishers themselves do offer services of that kind. But ideally, you know, you need your work to be checked by someone in the same discipline who is a native speaker, because, you know, then it will be written colloquially and it will, you know, respect the kind of disciplinary norms.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Dunford. I think that gives a really great overview and also some reassurance to scholars from whose language may not be English, that there are still many outlets, including ADP, and lots of assistance that can be provided. So in the interest of time, unfortunately, we have to wrap things up here, but Nick, just like to thank you once more for all of the insight you shared with all of the participants and panelists. And I'll turn things over to Daniela from the RSA.
Thank you very much, Mia, and thank you, Mick, for this very interesting session with the great insights. I hope participants got a lot out of this. The session is recorded, so if you want to go back and revisit the content of the session, you will have a chance in the RSA events on demand. In addition to this session, we will also have a professional development session on publishing, particularly focusing on journals and books as part of the Latin America session as part of RSA Global. And in the RSA Lounge, there are already 2 professional development webinars available on publishing. One is on how to choose the most suitable journal for your article. And the second one is what to expect from the publishing process. So people who are interested in this can also access these in the RSA Lounge. This is the end of RSA Global China, the second leg of the global journey we have. And I'd like to thank particularly Professor Wai-chung from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and our China division for all their work and support in this, making this event possible. In addition, I'd like to thank on behalf of the RSA all speakers who took the time and preparation and came and joined us here, and all the chairs as well, and all the participants. We had participants from far and wide. I think the furthest away was someone from Brazil. So that's a great result, and we hope you found it useful and enjoyable, the sessions. I also like to thank my colleagues behind the scenes, because quite often these are forgotten people. And I have Alex Holmes, I have Lisa Reynolds, and I have Katharina Berger, who made this event possible, setting everything up, promoting it. Looking forward to RSA Global. We are on the road again, however you want to, on the virtual road. So the next stop is Friday in Russia, on the 6th of November, and we will have a session there on diversity and inequality in urban and regional development. Next week then, on Monday, we will move on to Europe. We have the plenary session by Andres Rodriguez Pous on places that don't matter and their policy implications. We have a panel on place-based leadership and another panel on the role of universities in innovation and regional development. So this should be a very interesting stop again. Then we follow on and go to Africa. We have 3 sessions in Africa. We have one on post-conflict reconstruction in the Middle East, North African region. So this will give us some great insights. The second panel will be on planning in Nigeria. And the third session is a plenary by Ivan Turok on urbanization, economic density, and the pandemic. Following on from this, we're going over the pond to Latin America on Friday, the 13th of November, and we have Michael Stoper presenting the plenary session there. We have a session on a panel on local economic development in Latin America, and a professional development session, as already mentioned, on writing and publishing in academic journals. Our final stop is on Monday, the 16th of November, and this will be in North America. And the topic there of the plenary and panel is all about migration. So this will be very interesting in the context of the current election there. And the final session is our professional development session on communicating research for policymakers. So if you are working with policymakers, this is a session that should be really good. So that's all for today. Thank you very much. And until next time, stay safe, stay well, goodbye.